markets with a team of experts. I am Vandana Hari, founder of Vanda Insights and today's guest host. It's my pleasure to welcome the regular Monday guest on this show, Omar Najia. He's the global head of derivatives at BB Energy. Bora Barima, managing partner at Hormuz Straits Partnership, and Daniel Rahmat, a senior energy security and strategy consultant based in Iran. So for about a month now, crude prices have been swept up in the fear and risk aversion frenzy that began gripping the broader financial markets at the beginning of June. Of course, crude was swept up in that tide a little bit later. The pole star for investor sentiment has become the Fed's accelerated quantitative tightening program, of course, and speculation over how it's going to proceed, which seems to almost entirely hinge on consumer inflation data coming out of the US. So as we saw last week, US June consumer price inflation data at 9.1% spooked investors again. And crude took a dive as well alongside other risk assets. It slipped into bear territory yesterday, though as of now, where Brent is trading, by my calculations, it is actually just about but out of bear territory. So we're seeing a pattern in which each bout of crude sell-off has been followed by a small recovery. The net impact, of course, has been that prices have been sliding, but in what I like to call a sawtooth pattern. Omar, I'll start off with you. When you look at the roller coaster ride of the past month, shall we say, and you look ahead, how do you see the fear factor, which is, of course, mostly coming from the financial markets right now, and the fundamentals in the oil market balancing out?
So I think that in general, you have to have like a good reason for crude to either set new highs or set new lows. And right now, I think people are still long. I think people are long in the financial markets, obviously, and people are long in the oil markets. And the thinking is if you just hold on, it's going to be okay. And I think it's not going to be okay. And I think basically, I mean, maybe for this week, you see, the S&P bounce towards 4,000, the NASDAQ 12,200, 400, whatever, something like that. But then I think they're coming off. But oil, I think, we wanted it to get to $90, and it did. And then it bounced up again. And I think this kind of, I think basically we need to disgorge more of this length for the oil market to be quote unquote healthy again. You have to have everybody start to be negative oil for it to have a kind of, a chance to get into new all-time highs. I think too many people are thinking that, winter's coming, of course it is, and all this, but I think, oil needs to come off a little bit more before we get long again.
Yeah, not only is winter coming, but it looks like a very harsh winter for Europe. So how do you see the gas and power crisis playing out?
Europe is in a complete disaster because Europe has only filled, allegedly, 65% of what they need before, for winter in underground storage. So, and Nord Stream 1 is under maintenance between now and the 21st of July with zero flow. So basically, they're all tapping their underground storage. So it's going to be, the question is, what will Russia do? Will they turn it off completely? Will they basically keep flows as they were, increase it, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is, Europe has a very simple model in terms of economy. Very, very, very cheap energy that is used to manufacture stuff, expensive stuff that you sell, like, I don't know, Miele dishwashers or Porsche or Mercedes or whatever, right? Now that cheap energy is no longer cheap. I mean, it's massive. It's the most expensive energy on the face of this earth. So their electricity prices are massive. So their model is completely bust. So come winter, I mean, we've already seen the Germans declaring that you should take shorter showers. Maybe they stop the traffic lights. I mean, it's sad, but it's funny. The European, van der Leyen lady, her only plan is to reduce the heating of homes from whatever it is to 18 to 19 degrees. I mean, there's nobody. It's like, the ship is, it's like the Titanic, and there's no captain, there's no crew at all. So
Yeah, it
I don't
does
know
look
what's
like
going to happen.
a Titanic in slow motion, unfortunately. Bora, if you would help us unpack what's going on with the Fed policy and the swings in market sentiment, almost on an hourly basis, sometimes it seems. Now, last week, there seems to have been some relief in the markets towards the end of the week, because initially the June CPI figures came out and the market said, oh, it's going to be 100 basis point hike by the Fed when they meet later this month. And then we had the Fed officials downplaying that and sort of signaling that perhaps they'll stick to a 75 basis points hike. And the market seems to have cheered that. I suppose it's just, in comparison, relatively 75 basis points was a reason for reassurance for the market. Do you think, of course, your comment on that, but also, do you think US inflation data and Fed policy will remain in the driver's seat for oil prices for the foreseeable future, rest of this year?
Well, just before I think the live podcast started, we were talking about the direction of our administration being on autopilot to a certain extent, and I think they've set an autopilot, right, in a general direction. The U.S. central bank, the Fed, is pushing back against inflation. Finally, right? That's the story, and the economic data make it appear to be a sustainable strategy given the relatively strong employment data. So this was weighing down on most asset prices, and I think it should keep markets from rallying in some, let's say, frothy way, as we are experiencing. There's a sort of a concern about things. But stepping back, the effective Fed funds rate is around 1.5, 1.6%. That's compared to pre-COVID and 2019, 2.5%. So if they raised it 100 points, you would have just sort of been back to a normal situation. At a point when we don't have normal inflation, we have significantly above normal inflation, as you explained to us. So if they're going to step in front of the inflation cycle, they need to weigh on the aggressive end of the hikes. But they're clearly concerned about impact on a recession, a strong and deep recession, which they don't want to create. They want to kind of create this soft, shallow recession. But let me, and stepping back further, you see that divergence in the approaches that the U.S. is able to take with these 75 point, 100 point hikes, with its, and the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is impeded for whatever internal reasons. I would say primarily the sovereign credit profile of countries like Italy and the geopolitical energy uncertainty. And thus the euro has been pulled down to parity with the dollar. And I think these dynamics won't change for some time. As Omar said, some cost of living adjustments for Europe. They're not living the standards that they were used to consuming at, and the U.S. Talking the talk, pushing back with incremental rises, but I'm not sure that they are the sort of decisive, strong hikes that are required to really step down on inflation.
So you think they will stop a bit short of it, somehow try to maneuver a soft landing? Is that what you're saying? Or do you think they'll first probably go overboard and then retrace their steps?
I think what they're trying to do is, create expectations that rates could get high and that they will keep up these 75-point hikes and that they are committed to those. But they're giving themselves time to get there because there's that gap between the effective Fed funds rate, 1.5%, and the inflation at 9%. So they don't want to get ahead of inflation. So the consumer on the street is experiencing a real effective decline in their purchasing power.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is they can't offset it with putting their money in the bank and earning interest, clearly, or they can't be investing in any other real asset class right now either, because gold is down year on year, silver's down year on year, copper's down year on year. Yes, oil is up from a year ago, but it's still down from its recent highs. So it's difficult to avoid the pain of the erosion of the value of your assets in these days.
Yeah. Daniel, we are really lucky to have you on the show today, especially because, well, we've had some big news headlines from Iran over the weekend. One that caught my eye, at least, was an advisor of Khamenei saying that Iran is capable of building a nuclear bomb. Now, I don't know if that was just a threat. And well, frankly, I don't understand what the purpose of those statements are. Is it to try and bring all the parties back to the negotiating table for the nuclear deal? Or is it, just an off-the-cuff statement? We did see there were a couple of days of talks again on over the nuclear deal in Doha. I believe it was last month, which didn't go anywhere. Is the nuclear deal on the back burner again? And if so, for how long? Or should we just forget about it completely now?
Hello, everybody. Very, very glad to be here. And honestly, regarding the nuclear deal between Iran and the US, there is a truth, there is a reality that we need to consider, that the political structure of the Middle East and the whole circumstances have already significantly changed from 2015 when the JCPOA deal was signed between the world powers and Iran. As you know, the United States withdrew from the deal, and some further sanctions were imposed on Iran. The logic of Iranians for emphasizing on more demands comparing with what was signed in JCPOA is based on the reality that more sanctions were imposed on Iran after the deal, especially some sanctions on IRGC. One very significant military force in Iran, which has significant financial and economic capabilities in the country. And the second reason is some parts of those deals were somehow freezed based on the United States consideration. For example, the sunset conditions of that deal, which were regarding the Iranian military and some other nuclear activities of Iran. Based on the U.S. understanding, though, those parts of the deal are freezed, but Iran believes that since the JCPOA was in place during these years, that conditions, so that clauses should be implemented since now on. Anyway, based on my understanding, I don't have any access to any special intelligence regarding the Iranian officials' decisions or their statements, but generally, I believe that data statements comes very early before just before President Putin's visit to Iran. I think this is some signal to Russia. This means that Iran can be a part of the Russians' new bloc, or the new Eastern bloc against the West, with some extra capabilities, or maybe we can consider that statement based on a sort of muscle somehow reflection to the Western powers, that if you don't come back to the JCPOA based on my conditions, I can approach towards a nuclear weapon. We need some time to see what's going on.
Yeah. So the other headline is also, I'm glad you mentioned Russia, because the other headline is also Iran is looking to sell some killer drones to Russia. Is it like looking to sell, or is it a done deal? And so what exactly is happening here? If you could just elaborate a bit on the part where you say, is it like Iran is trying to get closer to Russia for greater leverage with the US? Personally, I would have thought it would go the opposite way.
Regarding the drones, I think Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials have already denied the news, but regardless that denial, Iran is already selling some drones to Tajikistan and some other countries. There's some news that Iranian drones were seen in Libya, they were officially operating in Syria. Iran's drone capability is significant, and it can be used in the Russian army in terms of the level of technology. But generally, I think what Iran is doing right now is considering, it actually is comparing what it can gain out of the JCPOA's revival, or getting closer to the Russian Federation as a strategic ally. I think JCPOA, even though it's revived, it's going to be a very temporary agreement between Iran and the US, because there is no guarantee whether the next US administration is going to remain loyal to this agreement or not. So a very short deal for the Iranian government is not going to force to remain in a deal, or to enter a deal which will result to a sort of strategic separation with Russia or even China. So I think if US cannot guarantee the deal, what I'm exactly saying is, if the US administration cannot guarantee the next administration's approach towards this deal, Iran is going closer and closer to the Russian Federation, regardless the economic outcomes.
And which it can't, right? No administration can guarantee. So that's a very interesting point you've made. Omar, OPEC Plus will be meeting again in about 2.5 weeks' time, and perhaps find itself at a crossroads again, because they have to contemplate the future of the production pact. And perhaps the future of the alliance itself. If you were to advise OPEC, what would you say they should do?
Break up. But no, I think basically, if you look at OPEC, you had Biden go to Saudi Arabia, right? He wasn't met by MBS at the airport, right? He was met by Khalid. So, I mean, people don't get the little nuances. And then when he was in the GCC meeting of ministers or whatever, he was nodding off and falling asleep. And when they were meeting inside, you could see, I mean, it was a quick video of the thing, but you could see MBS smirking. And when they said to him that, what about chopping up, a journalist, blah blah blah. Khashoggi, yes, and the Saudi side was what about Abu Ghraib? And so in other words, everybody tortures, everybody kills. So the problem is that the West has lost this kind of moral thing. But OPEC plus. Saudi can see the way the wind's blowing. Iran can see the way the wind's blowing. They've both, I think Iran has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Council or applied to. They're both going to apply to join the BRICS. So in other words, why do you need an agreement with Europe when Europe basically is, going down the, plug hole, let's say? So I think people see the way that everything's going. It's not just the Western economies in general. Italian GDP is like massive, 3 trillion or 2.78 or whatever it is, 150% of GDP. It's just ginormous. Consumer debt is massive. With the energy prices they have now, they will produce nothing that's competitive. In the same way, it's basically all this service economies, and they say, look at our GDP, and they measure GDP, by saying, it's a service economy. They produce absolutely nothing. The Russians produce, I don't know how many of these cruise missiles. I think they've used more cruise missiles in Ukraine than the Americans have in all their wars. And you look at the UK, you know how many cruise missiles the UK can produce? None, zero, because they don't have the manufacturing, the technology, the engineering, any of that stuff. So, I'm really sorry and sad that the world has moved on. So OPEC Plus is going to keep doing what it's doing. In other words, looking after their own interests. There is no more this kind of bullying that comes and says, we are the West, we are Europe. You have to stop poisoning the planet. You have to, Greta, whatever it is, how dare you, and all this kind of stuff. Now they're burning coal. They'll burn each other.
Exactly.
They don't care anymore. They don't care. So this facade, this mask, how could you kill a journalist? Well, what about Abu Ghraib? And this mask falls off and everybody looks and everybody sees. How is this extrajudicial kind of, I can impose sanctions on you, against international law?
Yeah.
So people are saying, fine, this is the West and this is the rest. And it is undeniable. The rest are going to win. They've already won. It's just a question when the West actually realizes it. Again, look at the leadership in the West, the political class. It's a joke. It's not just bad. It's literally a joke. The statesmen of old, people who had gravitas, learning, history, who actually did something with their lives, they're all gone. In the UK, we've got Bojo. I think the Economist said, the end of the clown fall. For God's sakes, it's terrible. So OPEC will do what they will look after themselves. No extra oil for Europe and the US and shoot themselves in the foot and commit suicide for Europe and the US. No.
It's the West and the rest, as you say. Bora, if I could get your views on some interesting developments, news items we had last week about Russian fuel oil moving into Fujairah storage, and of course Saudi Arabia buying much more fuel oil as well, presumably to power their electricity generation for the summer. If this is something that you do keep an eye on, welcome your thoughts on where do you think this fuel oil that is accumulating in Fujairah, where could it go? And do you think the world can now stop worrying about Russian refined products getting locked out of the market as a result of the EU sanctions?
Sanctions are very leaky tools, and I have been skeptical about the effectiveness of locking energy out of a global system, right? It's the laws of physics. There's going to be a leak unless you have a purely isolated system, and we don't have these such mechanisms. And clearly, even while I'm uploading my holiday photos on Facebook, I'm getting articles on that social media feed that Russian product is in Fujairah. Can you believe that? They have my preferences down to that level of detail on Facebook. And so the world can see this, that fuel oil is going to the GCC to replace indigenous production that would have been used for summertime cooling, and this allows additional crude barrels to go out into the market from the GCC to potentially, cosmetically satisfy calls from increased crude exports from the region to the West. I think we need to get back to realism. Yeah, if we're making the theme of this podcast international relations, when I studied several decades ago, I learned there are two camps in international relations: the realists and the idealists. And the idealists can, go out and fight wars to replace dictators. That's why they say they're fighting it. Or they can, fight wars to implement climate change regulations. And the realists sort of look at the situation and look at what's best for me in the context of my power, my alliances, the leverage I have on the other side. And I think it finally sort of dawned on the White House that Saudi Arabia is an important member of the G20. I mean, forget G20, it's an important economy, right? One of the 20 largest economies of the world. It's an essential leader of OPEC and, a vital state actor in the Arabian Gulf. And it's very important vis-a-vis relations with powers such as Iran. So Biden came. And, they need to get back to realism. These Obama, Biden slogans like pivot to Asia or, hold people to account for this or that, my goodness, they said they didn't like crude oil. It wouldn't be a geopolitical focus for them. They want to look at Asia. Well, what happens is Russia and China then pivot their attention back to the Middle East, and you need to come running back. So I'm not sure that the US administration truly gets the profoundness of the distortions which their energy and economic policies have created and that we're living with now, but it is certainly dawning on them. They're beginning to grasp this. They realize that the Fed can't print more oil onto the market, or the Fed can't, quantitatively ease more refining capacity to come back online. But it would be useful if the governments did not disincentivize investment into these areas in a very sort of ideological and moralistic way, like we saw during that COP26 last year. But we are where we are. But I would advocate a very realistic focus on energy security, of course, diversification of supply, and removing these bottlenecks in energy logistics, which means, investment in LNG import infrastructure, investment in pipelines, whether it's from Canada to US, or again, as I mentioned, LNG into Europe from other regions. And of course, North Africa will be a focus, connections from the Caspian through Turkey into the US should be a focus. We need just to be realistic rather than moralistic in our approaches.
Indeed. Both you and Omar have taken us into such interesting and deep pools of political debate. I almost lost track of time, and we ought to have the survey question. Let's not deprive ourselves of that. So it's a very short and quick one today. Do you think crude prices have bottomed out? As far as the rest of, let's just talk in terms of quarters, rest of this quarter is concerned, yes or no? Simple answer. So will we see them just rising from here, or are there greater depths to be plumbed? And while we give everyone a chance to respond to that, Daniel, I wanted to talk to you about Libya. So we've had some changes there as well. Last week, quite an upheaval, one could say. The NOC chairman was replaced, forcibly thrown out of his office, Mr. Sanala. And the new chairman who was installed, Farhad Bengdara, announced a deal with the protesters over the weekend and said that very soon all facilities will now ramp up to full capacity, full production, full exports. Libya will send out all the oil that the world needs from that country. Do you think this truce is going to hold? You're on mute, Daniel.
Oh, sorry for that. Let me start with a wider window regarding the energy supply and energy security, and I want to link this to the Russian crisis with Ukraine. I believe that Russians have taken three types of approaches based on a unique integrated strategy towards supply in the oil market. Let the gas market aside. Look, there's some countries like Iran and Venezuela, which are very major oil holders. Iran and Venezuela have 34% of the whole proven crude reserves in the world, but these two countries are sanctioned and they have very limited oil exports to the global markets. Russia's strategy towards these two countries is to try to keep them away from the markets and try to keep them under sanctions. And what is the mechanism of the Russians for proceeding such policy? During these several years of very harsh political relations with the U.S. and the West, these two countries, security-wise and military-wise, have become sort of under the Russian security umbrella. So if they get out of this umbrella, they will be threatened with the West, and they're going to probably facing some countermeasures from the United States, which they cannot tolerate. So the policy from the Russian Federation towards these two countries is to keep them away from the markets. The Russians' policy towards the other OPEC plus countries, OPEC, let's say, countries, is to somehow work with OPEC, is to somehow try to make some balance with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As you know, Russians are exporting more oil to the EU, and at the moment, Russians are exporting more to China and Asia, and Saudi and others are exporting more to the EU, to Europe. So this is a sort of deal between these countries. You remember when Crown Prince bin Salman was in G20 just after Khashoggi's case in Turkey, nobody shook hands with him but Vladimir Putin. There were some warm greetings between Vladimir Putin and Crown Prince bin Salman in that G20 summit. So those relationships had started several years earlier than the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and that was when the U.S. was trying to push more Iran and Venezuela and was just forgetting about the Saudi and the UAE when they had serious concerns about the activities of Iran in Yemen and elsewhere. So the Russians' approach towards these countries, these important oil-producing countries, is to somehow cooperate with them. But they have a third type of policy towards weaker oil-producing countries like Yemen and Kazakhstan. If, for example, regarding the Caspian pipeline, which connects Kazakhstan oil to the Black Sea, and thereby Kazakhstan exports something 1.5 million barrels per day. All these, let's say, attempts and efforts by the U.S. for pushing Saudi and the UAE to increase 2 million barrels per day could be wiped out with a sort of clique by the Russian oil administration to cut the Caspian oil pipeline, which exports or delivers 1.5 million barrels per day. Yemen is somehow very similar to Kazakhstan in terms of vulnerability against the Russians' presence in there. Russia has very significant military presence in Libya. Sorry, I always speaking about Libya. Libya has the same problem with Russians, because if Russians want, they can easily shut down most of their oil fields because they have significant military presence there. Also, the Houthis' presence in Bab el-Mandab Strait is very important because they can also easily disrupt significant oil flows to Europe, which are passing the Red Sea. So Russia's leverages at the moment is not limited to their own production or their influence on some countries like Iran and Venezuela. They have a very wider range of leverages, or their let's say their long hand can touch many other countries like Libya and elsewhere. So the situation in Libya is very dependent, based on my understanding, is very dependent on how Russians are going to solve their problem, whether they want to extend their disruption capabilities or disruption in practice in other countries, or they just want to use it as a political leverage in their negotiations with the EU in Ukraine.
Yeah, there will certainly be something to watch out for. I think this situation, what started out as a Ukraine war, is clearly has tentacles into a lot of other geopolitical shifts that are underway. I'm afraid we've run out of time, rather, not out of town. Here's the result of the poll. No, 63% people think crude will continue rising. It has not bottomed out. Excellent. With that, we say thank you very much to Omar, Bora, and Daniel, and of course to all our viewers and listeners in this podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vandana.